planes in different angles of viewing have content, right? And the way that there's already affect and information involved, even in the position of the body relative to a text, or the position of a camera relative to an event, right? And that those are always kind of already ideological events, and so to a certain degree, being able to read posture, being able to read the plane of viewing takes on, you know, political content, which is part of what that weird epigraph from Walter Benjamin at the beginning of the book is about. But that's a really nice observation about that poem.
Did being overseas in Madrid affect your perceptions of American culture and then in writing Angle of Yacht?
Yeah, I mean, it did in the sense that part of why I was in Madrid was to kind of read and think about Franco, right, the dictator for many years in Spain, and kind of meditating on right-wing politics and what fascism meant and the Spanish experience of a particular kind of dictatorship. Of course, like more than it led me to any conclusions about, you know, the Spanish experience, which I have no access to, just made me reflect on certain elements of mass politics and mass culture in the United States. So generally, that reading is somewhere in the book. For example, like Angle of Yacht is concerned in part with like memorialization, right? Like there's this poem about how to kind of memorialize, or if it's possible to memorialize September 11th. There's a poem about kind of the content of architecture and stadium seating. And one thing I was very interested in the landscape of Spain was the opportunity to see many centuries of political memorialization, right? Like monuments and debates about excavation. A lot of that was happening there. The other thing that happened when we were there were the bombings, you know, the bombings in Madrid, and that certainly, you know, catalyzed reflection on kind of our political moment. I mean, one of the things that was interesting about the bombings, which we were very close to geographically, is like I woke up in the morning and I read about the bombings on the New York Times webpage in my apartment. And then like I started realizing that the noise I heard outside the apartment wasn't like the normal noise of the morning. It was helicopters and people screaming. And it was a very disorienting experience of this mediation where I was realizing where I was only by looking at a New York newspaper. And so that, you know, a lot of the thinking about mediacy and its relation to politics and political violence was surely informed by being there. But maybe most immediately, because I'm not like an expert on any of those things, whatever that would mean, most immediately being outside of English made me just a very different, whenever I've been outside of English, I've had like suddenly I'm very fluent in English because I'm like running from my, you know, my always disappointing Spanish. And I was writing and reading English. I had a very fresh and kind of defamiliarized relationship to English, which I don't think I can get back by going abroad again. I've tried, but so probably most immediately it was just whenever you're out of your language, you're more self-conscious about your relationship to your fluency in your native language.
I was going to ask about didactic theology, how didactic is didactic theology? You were talking about this issue in class, and I was just very interested in the issue of, I mean, there are many statements, declarative statements, that ostensibly seem to be sincere in didactic theology, but it seems uncharacteristic of this moment in poetry statements that you intend to be taken literally. So I'm wondering how if that's something you thought about while you were writing it, if that's something you encountered in the perception of that.
Yeah, that's a really nice question. I mean, part of it is certainly to want that ambiguity to be present in the reading experience, right? So you're thinking to a certain degree, like to what degree can the poem be a serious vehicle for this kind of like intellectual work, right? And for that not to be easily kind of resolved in the reading, but to be like a question of like, what do we expect epistemologically from art? Like what kind of knowledge is art supposed to be able to possess or communicate? And of course, I don't have any answer to that. So describing a tension, I hope, is present in the poem. I mean, the genre of didactic poetry is, of course, like ancient, right? I mean, like literally ancient, from antiquity. And it's relatively recent in poetry to think of poetry as exclusively identified with, lyric emotion and intensity. So I kind of wanted to open up some of those older registers of poetry to think about, what it would mean to read something as a poem, but also as argument, right? But I mean, I also think that the poem is full of the irony that it has a tone that is very didactic, right? I mean, the didactic elegy wasn't supposed to be the pejorative didactic tone in antiquity, but this also has like this flatness that's very difficult to read, that I hope kind of enacts that difficult project of trying to get critical distance from an event that's contemporary. So I don't know, I'm just throwing language to that observation, which is a very good one. I also was interested in that book and thinking about how, I mean, those are some of the most prosaic sentences in the book, even though the book is largely in prose poems, right? And so there's a kind of generic tension where you expect lyric intensity, you have to look in the prose poems, and when you look in verse is where you encounter this older task of the genre to convey knowledge or something. I don't know if it actually conveys any knowledge, but it might open up a little bit the possibilities of thinking about poetry as something other than just the short poem of lyric intensity.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please join us. We have books for sale and cupcakes.